means to change the things we love. And so it's in that frame that I speak here today. And for our revolution, this came somewhat naturally because, as Jonathan said, we started with a primary campaign in 2015 and 2016 to elect Bernie as the nominee, going up against more than the front runner initially in May Day of 2015 when Bernie announced Hillary Clinton. And these issues of foreign policy, war and peace were, if they weren't the exact center, trade policy, also foreign policy, they were close to it, along with obviously economic justice issues that Bernie is well known for. So that primary for us sort of set a stage. Number one, for me personally, for many of us in that campaign, we had a commitment from Bernie that we would go on beyond the campaign. It wasn't about him, although we would have been delighted had we won, but it was about building this kind of political movement with political organizations that would be networked together. And that's what happened. And so coming out of that, when we launched our revolution, we started, believe it or not, with 8 million people joining on email. And I'm not saying the 8 million did anything, but it's an incredible resource when we get into this issue of primaries, because we know where the 8 million people live. They've all done something in the last 6 years. But when it comes to mobilizing in a primary, we start out with an incredible resource. On the average, 10,000 people in any of the districts that we're talking about with Democratic primaries, 10,000. And typically it's 40,000 to win a primary. So it's incredible. And there's very little convincing whether our lead issue was this issue or any of the ones I mentioned. They're all, people who joined our revolution on some level and were Bernie supporters. So when we talk about, our revolution issues are the base. The right side of the triangle is elections and referenda, and the left side is what we call transforming the party, which could be an independent party, but in most cases it means changing the Democratic Party. These things are all intertwined, and in all cases we go up against, besides every Republican, which we should never forget, we have virtually no Republicans on any of our core issues at this moment in time. Virtually none. Now, we could find, stop the war in Yemen might have had some. So I don't want to say there's none ever on anything. But the political strategy that is almost all within the Democratic caucus in the House, and then trying to fight with the Senate, the worst Senate rules ever. They've been this way for 15 years, but they're the worst ever, to try to get a bill on the floor and passed in the Senate. But the focus for our revolution, and I would argue for all of us, if we're going to focus on Democratic politics, it's the House of Representatives, because the House of Representatives has the Congressional Progressive Caucus. It now has 96 members. I would call 50 of them core, 45 are convenience. But nonetheless, when they take a position, and you can't stay in the caucus if you don't vote with the caucus 2/3 of the time and show up for half the meetings. They're mostly phone meetings, but those two things are new. So it's beginning to have some rigor to it. And when the caucus takes a position, as they did on the nuclear weapons, as they did on end fossil fuel subsidies, as they did on wealth taxes and Medicare for all, it gives you the launching pad to then fan out into the committees, like armed services in this case, and start out with something rather than start out as an issue-based organization lobbying everybody individually. So working within the caucus to get the caucus to take a position is key. And then politically, getting more people to join the caucus is key. So let's take the Texas primary, which just the round one was March 1st. So our revolution and many other groups were heavily involved there, but not just Jessica Cisneros versus Henry Cuellar, who's the worst Democrat on any issue in the House of Representatives. Any of the issues I mentioned, he even voted against the PRO Act, the Protect the Right to Organize for Workers, the only Democrat to vote no on the PRO Act. But so that primary is well known, and there's a runoff, and Cisneros has a good chance to win that primary. But we also elected Greg Casar, new district in Austin. He's decidedly with us on these issues. issues of war and peace and all the other issues I mentioned. And then we have a runoff in Dallas, Jasmine Crockett, who's way ahead. She got 47%, a brilliant African-American lawyer. The next highest, who's a center-right Democrat, got 15%. But the runoffs in Texas are on at the end of May, I think May 27th. Those two are going to be key, Crockett and Cisneros, because again, who would think that in Texas we have a chance to pick up 3 more progressive caucus members who are going to be with us on these issues? And again, the goal has to be to get a majority of the caucus, put aside majority of the House. If you get a majority of the caucus, it can be a caucus position, and then you have a good chance to pass what you want, whether it's the military budget, cutting it back, ending the new round of nuclear weapons, the war in Yemen, War Powers Act. We could go on with the list for the core of this audience, let alone the broader list. So, so for our revolution, I'm not going to read them all off, but there's, in addition to those 3 in Texas, one of whom is one. That's a single party district. So this is another point. Most Democrats and also Republicans, but most Democrats are elected in a single party district where there's virtually no chance, short of a scandal, that there's no chance that the other party, the Republican Party, is going to win. So the result is that all the corporate money, which in this case, for this topic, is the military-industrial complex, floods these elections. And if we take one example, Jonathan told me half the audience is from Massachusetts. The key vote that we're missing on every issue we care about is Richard Neal, and he's the second only to Pelosi, most powerful Democrat in the House. He's the chair of Ways and Means. So any spending bill must go through Ways and Means. And I'll give you one example. It's not military spending in this case, but ending fossil fuel subsidies, which is a total absurdity and would save tens of billions of dollars a year. The day before final markup for Build Back Better, he knocked that out, a final markup on a Sunday, and his final vote was on a Monday. It had been in the markup. And he did that with Pelosi because 5 Texas Democrats asked for that, who were linked and funded by the fossil fuel industry, as he is. And he's also funded by pharma and the military-industrial complex. He basically has his is a little closer, but a Democrat is going to win that district no matter what. So all the corporate money pours in there. But we have a list of about 25 of these. I'll just read off the states. Massachusetts, as I said to Jonathan, sadly is not on here. It's not too late. But Massachusetts, of the 9, I'd say 6 of them ought to have an opponent, but that's my personal view. 3 of them are quite good. But aside from Texas, we have Ohio, which is Nina Turner. We have Oregon, where we have 2 districts, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Kentucky, Georgia, California, Nevada, Illinois, New York, Maryland, and Michigan. Those are all states. There's 25 altogether there where we could easily win. I shouldn't say easily, where we could possibly win. And we'd be picking up 25 more caucus members if they all won. They're not all going to win. But, and significantly moving the ball towards the moment, even in this year where everybody talks about, gloom and doom, whether we like it or not. For us, it's having a majority of the majority, and the general election is second. So the last primary is Rhode Island on September 13th. Connecticut might also be that day, I forget, where David Siegel is running in an open seat. There's 2 seats in Rhode Island, and David Siegel is in our camp of on nuclear weapon on every issue we talked about here. Right. So that's not till September 13th. So then after that, yeah, progressives, we would look and see in the general election, are we going to make a difference in any of these House districts? And there could easily be Senate places where we would weigh in because it does make a difference. It could be lesser of 2 evils, but it obviously makes a difference. So I'm going to stop there.
Thanks.
And I'll just sum up if I have 1 more minute, which is the issues are central. Nothing to take away. The majority of our work will always be on issue education and action. Secondly, that if we don't do primaries, we're not going to move. If we need federal legislation, it's very unlikely without doing primaries, we're going to have a majority of the party caucus in order to get change. The third is that the Congressional Progressive Caucus is a functioning, organized, getting better all the time grouping that we can all weigh in with. And the last thing, which I actually didn't mention, is that the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee sucks. And otherwise, they look for they defend every incumbent, and they look for big money, and they look for candidates that raise their own money and start out with enough money to win. They could care less about any of the issues that we love.
All right, thanks. All right, thank you so much, Larry. We're going to have a few initial questions. Susan Mirsky will call on people. Maybe just put your name, put stack in the chat, or raise your hands, both. And Susan will find you. Provided Susan's here. Susan, are you on? Oh, maybe not. Okay.
Susan is on, but she's muted. I wasn't aware she was.
Alice, I'll call on Alice. Unmute.
So, Jonathan, I have to unmute people. So,
okay. So
you can't unmute until I let
okay.
Alice. Okay. Okay. Go
Okay.
ahead.
I'm unmuting.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Larry. This was so educational to me about, the Progressive Caucus and what it means and what it doesn't mean. What are we doing in terms of the climate movement? In other words, that's so powerful right now. We just can't ignore what's going on with the climate movement. I know you're talking about the fossil fuel subsidies, but about this, like getting all of us together to primary everybody, what are we doing about Manchin? Do we have a whole climate group and military? I don't think we have to live with him. I think if we really went door to door and got all our voters out, we have more people than they do all the time.
Yeah, well, Manchin is a sad, sorry case. He's got 2 more years. So I focused on the House, and partly because the Senate seats are so bought off. You could count on one hand the number that aren't. The House is still retail politics, getting harder and harder because now it's 770,000 people in a House district, unless it's a small state with 1 or 2 members. It could be a little bit less than that. But, you can go door to door and you make a difference. As I said, in a primary in the House, you need 40,000 votes. Now, in a small state, that could be true in the Senate. But anyway, I focused on the House. Manchin's got 2 more years. The one we can beat in 2 years for sure is Sinema. Manchin's like 75. I don't know if he even runs again. But Sinema, again, the Arizona Democratic Party is on the move. All of our groups and allies, including our revolution, have bored into that party. And I didn't stress the party part of this, but the party structure there, they have a huge central committee and state convention. Every state is not like this. The East Coast is much worse in terms of democracy in the party, but that's an understatement. But anyway, they basically censured her on 2 or 3 different positions that she took. And I can't imagine that she could win a Senate primary in 2024. But I focused for this year on the House, number 1, because it's a giant opportunity. And actually, number 1, because retail politics works there.
Okay, do we have time for one more question?
Yeah.
Jonathan, okay, I see Steve Watrous asked a question, and Lilly Dragnev gave an answer in chat. But Larry, what do you think? Steve, do you want to pose your question? Where are you? Steve?
Sorry, Ms. Susan.
Okay.
I have to unmute them. Who is Steve? Steve Watrous. Okay.
Yeah, I would definitely say yes. But somebody should say, if Steve's going to talk, that's great. But he asked about joining that caucus. Yes, that should be a commitment from anybody we support.
Hi, Steve Watrous in Milwaukee here. I work with Peace Action and the United Nations Association and the FCNL and some others on these things. We made an effort to try and promote the Spokane Lee Caucus. Spokane, of course, is from Madison and more liberal than our person, Gwen Moore, but we twisted her arm to join that caucus, and it seemed like a good idea.
Yep.
We, on the other hand, David Swanson, who sometimes weighs in on these things, says, well, that caucus is a waste of time. So I guess I've heard both ways on that. Any opinion?
Yeah, so first of all, Mark is the chair of the CPC, the Congressional Progressive Action Committee, something like that, which is the political action arm of the CPC, the Congressional Progressive Caucus. And so, these things are totally interrelated. So I would say to you, to the extent that we work in coalition on these issues, which I would say is critical, meaning the climate issues, military spending, tax issues, that those groups work together. The key is to get people to join the Progressive Caucus, but it's also key to get the Progressive Caucus to take the position of Spokane Lee in the caucus, because that then binds those 96 members. Now, again, as I said, a third of the time they can bolt the caucus, but it more or less binds the whole caucus on those issues of war and peace and foreign policy. So, the short answer is yes, from my point of view.
Thank you. All right, we're going to, the discussion will continue, but I want to move on to Shailly Gupta Barnes, who's the National Policy Coordinator for the Poor People's Campaign and works out of the Cairo Center associated with Riverside Church in New York City. Shailly.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Great. Thank you for inviting the Poor People's Campaign and the Cairo Center to be part of the discussion. Our approach is a little bit different because we are nonpartisan, although we're deeply political. Although, of course, we share, obviously, the same priorities. And before this moment, leading up to the midterms and likely beyond, our approach is to look at these injustices of militarism alongside systemic racism, poverty, and climate justice, look at them all together. And our theory of change is that in order to address them, not only do we have to address them together, but we have to do so by bringing together those who are most impacted by them. That the way to change the politics of the nation, whether it's who's in the House, who's in the Senate, will be to prioritize poor and low-income people, the 140 million poor and low-income people in this country, and bringing them together across these deep divisions of race, geography, and issue. And unless and until we can unite around those interests, then we'll continue to not only be divided against each other, but we'll continue to see our democracies, our democracy eroded, our communities torn apart by war, by policing, incarceration, climate chaos, poverty, just everything we're facing. And so, although we don't endorse specific candidates, our politic is rooted in this 140 million and building the unity of, as King called it, a new and unsettling force. And so just connecting through what we've seen this past year is that the slim majority that was held by the Democrats in the Senate and, for, a fairly narrow margin in the House compromised big parts of what could have been a really bold agenda. And most of those compromises were made on the backs of the poor. We can point to a couple of senators, who held that back in the Senate, and every Republican senator, as Larry reminded us. But it really is evidence of how voter suppression, although it specifically targets Black, Brown, Latino, Native, and poor voters, it also facilitates these policy-based attacks on the poor more broadly, whether it's leaving living wages out of the legislation, refusing to expand Medicaid, or wiping out medical debt or student debt, whether it's cutting out the child tax credit from the current economic package, from allowing these widespread attacks on voting rights. All of these are compromises that are made on the backs of the poor. Giving subsidies and tax credits to fossil fuel companies is a compromise on the poor. Raising military spending, raising policing budgets, all of these are compromises on the poor. And so I wanted to talk about for a few minutes about what we found in the 2020 elections and the participation of poor and low income voters, who, again, must be at the very center of our politics for this reason, because they are both the front, hit first and worst by these attacks. But once these decisions are in place, they reverberate out to broader sections of our society, most of it, in fact. Yet if we engage poor and low income voters explicitly, directly, and continuously, we could shift the political maps of this country. We could change our political priorities, away from war, away from militarism, and towards the programs and policies we actually need. Now, this won't happen in one election cycle or even in 2 or 3. It's a long-term strategy, but it's a direction we have to go, not just for the Democrats, not for Republicans, not even for the poor, but really to save, what we believe this country can be. So according to our assessment of the 2020 elections, there were over 50 million poor and low-income voters who turned out to actually vote in 2020. And they accounted for about 1/3 of all the votes that were cast. In some battleground states, they accounted for even higher percentages of the vote share. Now, I'm not saying all these people voted the same way. We know they didn't. But given these numbers, given the high percentage of the vote share, some of them must have joined together across race, Black, Latino, Native, poor, white voters, and voted for an agenda that promised better, more affordable healthcare, higher wages, a climate response. Whether or not that was delivered is a separate question, but they must have voted in common around something. And alongside those 50 million people who did vote, those 50 million poor and low income voters, there was another 30 some poor and low income voters who didn't vote. They were eligible, but who didn't vote. So we're talking about over 80 million poor and low income people who are eligible to vote in 2020. This is a huge political force. If they were organized to take action together, if they weren't pit against each other through our two-party system that takes advantage of race, that uses war, that, perpetuates poverty and fear, often through distorted religious beliefs to keep this force from finding itself. And if this force were organized, maybe, just maybe, some of the promises that were made in 2020 would have been carried forward through our current administration. And so so what does this mean for 2022? I have kind of 3 lessons I wanted to carry forward that we can, I think, carry forward from 2020 and 2021 into this year. So as we move into the elections, first, don't give up on poor and low income people. Don't give up on poor and low income voters. In 2020, we reached out to 2 million eligible voters who are also low propensity voters, so low income, low propensity voters who had not engaged in the past 2 or 3 election cycles. We didn't talk about any party. We reached out to them as the Poor People's Campaign and encouraged them to vote. And that outreach, we found, had a statistically significant and positive impact on their turnout. It wasn't the only factor, but it did contribute to their turnout. And in a place like Georgia, our outreach had a positive impact on over 39,000 voters, 3 times as many as the margin of victory. These voters will turn out, but they must be engaged. And there are many more issues to engage them on this year, whether it's voter suppression, whether it's healthcare, whether it's incomes and inflation and war. All of these are worse, in this lead up to 2022 than they were in 2020. So second, don't give up on poor white voters. 1/3 of the voters we reached out to were poor white voters. And according to our analysis in the battleground states in 2020, poor white voters accounted for a larger vote share than all other low-income voters combined in those states. Now, again, some of them must have voted with poor and low-income voters of color around the same agenda. We cannot cede these voters over to the right and over to an extremist agenda. Instead, and this is my 3rd lesson, we have to build an agenda that can and will engage and win these voters across race, and allies, a pro-poor, pro-worker, pro-climate, pro-peace agenda that improves the lives of 140 million. We know what needs to be in it. We also need people who are willing to fight for it and who will refuse to compromise on the poor any longer. And sorry, I realized I had 4 lessons, not 3. The 4th is to stick and stay. Whatever the outcomes in 2022, which may not be favorable to this agenda, which may not be favorable to many of our priorities overall, we need to stick with these issues through election cycles to organize this political bloc. The organizing that we put into 2020 can establish a stronger base to grow from. This is what the campaign will be doing, has been doing, what we'll do through the midterms, bringing all of these different sectors together on climate, whether it's in civil rights, peace, et cetera, building in these key states like West Virginia, like Arizona, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Ohio, Texas. The mass Poor People's and Low Wage Workers Assembly and March on Washington on June 18th is also a march to the polls in November. We still have not seen what the power of people coming together around these shared priorities can be, whether it's on the political agenda in the midterms, in the media, or whatever. That is up to us. It's up to us to decide what we do, where we stand in relationship to the 140 million, whether we are impacted, whether we are moral allies. But all of us need to turn out in June as people of faith and conscience, as poor and impacted people, and for the priorities that we all care about. So that's what I wanted to say here tonight. And thank you all for the opportunity to share that with you and be in conversation.
Thank you so much for that vision. The floor is open. I'm sure Shailly will take some questions or comments. Cole, if you have the unmute button, maybe.
Yeah, who should I unmute?
Richard Burrell, Sharon Abreu.
Okay, Richard Burrell. I'm sorry, I'm looking for him. Oh, here he is. Sharon Abreu. Okay. Richard.
There we go. I unmuted it myself. Can you
Great.
hear me okay?
Yeah.
I would just want to follow up on what Shailly just said. As the co-founder of the New Poor People's Campaign, Bishop William Barber II has told us that what we need to do if we want to get votes from people, particularly in this case, poor people, we need to go to the hollers and the hoods. And obviously he's talking about when you get there, you have to listen to those people, and then you have to explain to them, this is what we're going to do, and we're going to get your votes, but you've got to come out. I think that quote is actually aimed at sorry guys, but I vote Democrat, at the elite Democrats who think the money is more important, so they just go to the Hamptons, for instance, to get the money and not bothering with the poor people. And as Shailly said, we really need to organize the poor, and then we have it offset. That's it.
Just to comment on that, there was we went into Harlan County, West Virginia, in 2019. It was before the 2020 elections, and what they had basically told us was they hadn't seen a Democratic candidate in there in decades. And so, there are these places that, and they were very open to building with us, building with the Poor People's Campaign, building with, around common interests. When we showed them, when we showed the folks their maps that looked at voter suppression across the country, that looked at healthcare conditions across the country, poverty, child poverty, et cetera. One person stood up and said, well, they've been lying to us the whole time in terms of who's impacted by this. And yes, people are ready. People are smart. People are, they want to change the conditions going on in their lives. We can't give up.
Hey, Sharon. Sharon, you're muted. Can you unmute? You're trying? Keep trying, please.
Okay, I think I got it.
Okay, great.
Keep remuting on me. Oh, yeah. Hi, Shailly. Thank you very much. I just want to ask you, how can we effectively address very understandable wariness, cynicism, lack of trust in low-income communities where people have been promised things that have not been delivered on over and over again? And when people do come in, they tend to look like me. And, people, I'm just concerned about people who feel used and are not empowered to be able to make change in their own communities. Can you speak to that?
I mean, what I've learned is that in every community, there are local leaders who are trying to do the very best they can for and with their community members. And as people who are not part of those communities, you have to know who those people are. You have to approach them. You have to work with them to identify these issues. We can't go in, based on our own understanding of what is most important, right? And then, the listening is part of it, but offering an open and frank conversation is important, showing that, this is genuine and has integrity, and that there's a history behind it and I think this is part of the sticking and staying. It is very easy to come in it is easier, let's say, to come in for a short amount of time and then, work really hard to try to get a certain outcome. And based on what happens with that outcome, then determine your next steps, rather than kind of the slow spade work, as it's been called before, of actually building those relationships for the long haul. The what we're confronting was not put in place in one administration, in one, Congress, but the product, or even, one decade. These are policies and programs that we've been confronting for 50 years and sometimes longer. And so to change that, we have to build something that can last through one congressional cycle, one election cycle, or even 2 or 3. And that begins with building relationships.
Thank you. Thank you. Very helpful. All right, let's go on to Medea Benjamin, who's been, founder of CodePINK, and an extraordinary voice of sanity in this insane Ukraine situation. Medea, so happy to have you on board. Just unmute yourself. Oh, you're speaking on the phone.
Yeah, I'm trying to unmute on the phone.
We hear you. It's good.
Do you have are you on a phone number?
Can you unmute me on the phone?
Well, we hear you. We hear you.
Are you
Okay.
847-744?
Yes.
Okay, I'll admit that one too.
Oh.
I don't know. It sounds fine as it is.
All right, I'll talk. Sure. I just hear an echo. So I'm sorry if I come across as the angry person without a lot of hope for the Democratic Party when it comes to peace. But I feel that, as somebody put in the chat, we have 2 war parties. And right now, we might have some differences when it comes to Ukraine, but I feel like pouring more weapons into this and having Pelosi and Schumer inviting Zelensky to speak before Congress, knowing that he was going to call for a no-fly zone, more warplanes. I thought that was a terrible move that undercut any kind of real emphasis on negotiations. In terms of the Pentagon budget, we obviously were not winning even before Ukraine, and it'll be a lot harder now. Even before Ukraine, we didn't have the majority of the Progressive Caucus even calling for or voting for a reduction in military spending. And when Larry was asked about this military spending reduction caucus, it's a ridiculous caucus because it has no guidelines. It doesn't say you have to be in favor of calling for a 10% reduction in the Pentagon or 5% or 1%, nothing. And when we've talked to the leadership and asked them, what are you going to do? How are you going to build opposition to the ever increasing Pentagon budget? We didn't get an answer. So I feel like we've been abandoned by the progressives, even in the Democratic Party. The most they'll do is maybe vote against the budget, but they don't fight for it. The only thing I see them do once in a while is put out a tweet about it. And, we're talking about real money, big pots of money that could fund the other things that we really care about. One thing that we could use a lot of help for is making it very personal. And we have a Divest from War campaign where we ask members of Congress to pledge not to take money from the 5 big weapons manufacturers. And we have a couple of dozen Congress people who have taken that pledge so far, but it would be great if we could get all members of the Progressive Caucus to do that. And you can see the pledge by going to codepink.org/divest Congress. We have, Larry mentioned the Yemen war. I feel like Biden has done an end run by saying that he's only giving defensive weapons to the Saudis. And there's really no difference between what he calls defensive and offensive weapons. So I think we should ask all candidates, are they in favor of cutting all support to the Saudis and the UAE in their horrific war on Yemen, which we should compare to the war on Ukraine. And in the case of Yemen, many, many, many more people have died. We also have to talk about the Israel issue and how it's been so hard to get even members of the Progressive Caucus to take a good stand when it comes to Israel. We shouldn't be funding Israel. It's a middle-income country. It should get zero of our money. But we continue to give almost $4 billion every year. And the most we can ask for now is that there be a little bit of conditioning around the worst of Israel's human rights abuses. I think now that we even have Amnesty International calling Israel an apartheid state, we should be able to convince members of the Progressive Caucus that conditioning aid to Israel, if not cutting all aid to Israel, is a reasonable position, just like Betty McCollum's legislation to defend Palestinian children should be a pretty reasonable thing that we should get all members of Progressive Caucus and all new candidates for Congress to support. I want to talk a minute about US policy towards Latin America because it's been so atrocious. And we see the Biden administration continue to recognize Juan Guaido as the head of Venezuela, something that makes zero sense. So we should be asking candidates, who is the president of Venezuela? It would be just nice to have a response to that question. And then there is the follow-up question about sanctions that have killed over 100,000 people in Venezuela, a kind of open warfare. And really, we should be asking candidates what they think about economic warfare that is a form of collective punishment, whether it's against the people of Russia or Venezuela or the people of Cuba. And I think it is important that we talk to candidates about why we have, after 60 years, a policy on Cuba that Biden has continued, which is the Trump policy, not the Obama policy. The Obama policy of normalizing relations, opening up trade, allowing family remittances, encouraging, allowing travel, has been rolled back by Trump and rolled back further by Biden. So I think it's important to ask people if they think the policy towards Cuba should be the one of the Obama administration or the one of the Trump administration. And let's see, wrapping up here, two positive things. I think we will get an agreement in the next few days around the Iran nuclear deal. And this will be a very important step forward for negotiations and diplomacy at the time of this horrific war in Ukraine. And we could ask why it took over a year for the Biden administration to do what they could have done in the first week. But if we get a deal, that would be good. And I think it does bring up this larger issue about nuclear holocaust at the time of this Ukraine crisis, where people are maybe understanding the moment that we are in And maybe this gives us an opening, whether it's around the Iran nuclear deal, the Korean lack of even a peace treaty, and the larger issues about nuclear weapons, the New START treaty, the INF treaty, the modernization of our nuclear weapons, and the call that all progressive candidates and all progressive members of Congress should be able to agree with, that we need to support the UN treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons. So that's just some remarks for our conversation. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much.
I'm looking, I don't see anybody's hand up at this point, but please raise your hand so we can call on you. In the meantime, somebody had asked, or I think Lilly made a comment that all of you, all three speakers, spoke about the need to reinvest our resources from wars into critical domestic issues. So thank you, the three. Any questions? Raise your hands.
Well, if not, we'll go on to Lilly, and people who have late forming questions or comments to Medea can ask it at the end. Lilly Dragnev is on the national staff of National Peace Action, heavily involved with Peace Action's involvement in the Congress, and pushing for the right stuff. Lilly, take it.
Hey, thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, I am involved with Congress. I'm also involved with those that we want to get into Congress, right? So our electoral work, unfortunately, not all of our candidates make it to Congress, at least not right away, but it usually takes a few runs, as you might know, before a candidate can build that name recognition and push against the establishment in particular. So within our primary work, Peace Action has really ramped up our endorsements within the primaries these last few cycles. And honestly, I think that that's partly because of the wonderful work that our colleagues like Larry and Shailly do on the ground, working with organizers and, inspiring folks to run for something, right? Medea as well, just getting to those communities and encouraging folks to run is so critical. And, the Peace Action PAC is a bit more modest than some other groups out there. And certainly when it comes up against the Democratic establishment, we don't have that kind of money. And so where can we make the most difference? That comes into those races where we can engage people in communities. And so I'm actually going to put our list of candidates in the chat so you can look into who we've endorsed. So I don't have to really go into all of that. But, we look at folks nationwide, and one of the processes behind our endorsements is the questionnaire. And so basically all the things that Medea listed are things that we ask of our members. We've actually been told that our questionnaire is a bit on the long side. And so we've had some candidates complain about the thoroughness of it, because within the questionnaire, we not only ask questions on these issues, but we also educate as well, to try to let candidates know, because especially in House races, sometimes, in middle America, you might not have folks that are as familiar with what's going on around the military industrial complex and all of these issues. And so we want to be a resource for educating candidates as well as endorsing and supporting them. So all the folks on that list, if you click on the link, are people who have passed our questionnaire with flying colors. They've talked about sanctions and Palestinian rights in our kind of language. And, we essentially, once we make our endorsements, look for ways to help these candidates get to Congress, because, I think as everybody else has basically talked about already, one of the ways that we can change the votes and change the status quo and shift the party is through bringing in new voices, peace voices. Obviously, another thing that Peace Action works on is our lobbying and working with existing members of Congress to try to sway them on the issues. But that's really long term, right? I mean, I know one of the stories I heard when I first started with Peace Action was about how Senator Feinstein of California started out as being pro-nuclear weapons and deterrence in her thoughts. And through the years, Peace Action, kept working with her and really pushed her to become one of the anti-nuke champions right now. And she's on one of the major committees for that sort of legislation. But she's not great on a lot of other issues, right? And so that's the trouble. Even when we can push a person on one thing, sometimes these folks just aren't in alignment on all the issues. And so things that, Larry and Shailly and Medea talked about, we want to make sure we're getting people endorsed who aren't just going to vote the right way, but are going to be leaders. And we saw that with the squad, right? So Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, once they came into Congress, Ayanna Pressley out in Massachusetts, they immediately shook up the status quo, right? They came out and they weren't afraid to be vocal about the need for change. Larry spoke of transforming the party, right? And so we need people who aren't just going to vote and passively stand by while others lead. They will themselves put policies forward. And we've been lucky enough at Peace Action to support numerous such candidates as Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib from the get-go. And right now we've seen, Cori Bush, Jamal Bowman, Marie Newman, in this new generation of people coming into Congress who are also starting to build the voice for change. And so, our strategy in the Peace Action PAC and at the national office is to really ramp up our primary work as part of this long-term push toward changing the party. It's a long-term strategy. Shailly was talking about that. Jessica Cisneros is someone who, for instance, we supported in 2018 in her run against Henry Cuellar, and she came just a few thousand votes short. I think it was like 2,000 votes short. This go around, she has forced him into a runoff, and we're very excited to still be by her side and support her in this. There was another candidate you probably didn't hear about because she didn't win her race, but Nabila Islam was running in the Atlanta area in Georgia in the 2020 cycle, and we supported her as well in her primary, which she ultimately lost to Carolyn Bordeaux, who is much more hawkish on these issues. But, in Nabila's run, she was able to engage a lot of the Southeast Asian community in the area that wasn't necessarily as involved in electoral politics or really, included in outreach. And those people likely helped Biden win the critical state, right? And so these are people that we can't overlook. Shailly was talking about not overlooking certain communities. And that's another strategy that we look at with our primary endorsements. Where can we help this bigger picture? Even if one candidate doesn't necessarily win their race, what impact can their run have? Can they inspire and engage community members to change the district and its composition and its lean? Or can they force the incumbent into voting better? We saw races in Arizona and California last cycle that, again, ultimately did not result in a win by our primary endorsees, but pushed their incumbents to vote a little better on peace and on other issues. Obviously, we still want those folks out of Congress because they're still not in alignment, but at least now we have a little bit more communication with them than we previously had because they had primary challengers who pushed them and showed them that they're vulnerable. And another strategy is supporting our current incumbents and champions. People don't often think about it, but like Rashida Tlaib, for instance, has 3 primary challengers right now. It's not fully likely that they can take her down, but it's still a threat that she shouldn't have to face. And because she's so progressive, a lot of the establishment Democrats aren't necessarily standing behind her to support her from these 3 primary challengers, right? And so she's got these pushes from the right. Plus, with the redistricting process right now, it has made all kinds of weird scuffles between, progressives and sort of more moderate, middle of the road folks. So, for instance, Andy Levin in Michigan right now, who has been great on our issues, has like a 96% voting record on peace issues, is right now having to face a primary challenge against Haley Stevens, who is like at 50, 60%. Like she's just very hawkish in her policies, and they're polling equally. So that's just an extra, weird thing of this cycle that we have to worry about. Basically, I want to sum up and keep it brief in the three critical things that I think are important to this strategy. And one of them is candidate recruitment. So again, as I said, a lot of these folks who are running now are activists and community leaders, right? They've been involved in these communities and they're stepping up and running, and we can support them in these primary challenges to the establishment. We have the power to push folks in these communities early on, and we should do that, So in addition to working alongside community leaders, we can call on them to run and inspire others in the district. Voter engagement is obviously critical. And, Shailly spoke really well about that, so I won't get too much into it. But one thing to keep an eye out for is that Peace Action is right now trying to ramp up its phone banking efforts. Because of the pandemic, virtual phone banking is easier than ever. So a lot of campaigns have made it easy to just dial in from your home versus having to go in person to an office to do volunteering. And so we're going to be pushing and promoting more phone banking opportunities and text banking. Thank you. Yes. So, it's important not to overlook any voters. And we also have Meet the Candidates events in which we spotlight a candidate and their foreign policy issues, and then, again, promote phone banking, text banking, volunteering. And so our next one is coming up this week. So feel free to check it out. It's a wonderful Chicago area candidate that we're supporting, Junaid Ahmed. He's taking on Raja Krishnamurthy, who is huge millions of dollars of corporate money coming into his campaign, moderate, kind of just hawkish, blah Democrat who always votes for bloated Pentagon spending, which makes sense given he's getting money from them. But of course, to this, a major hurdle is voting rights attacks. And so that's all the more reason volunteering and engaging voters nationwide in these campaigns, not just your own communities, is so critical. Because while in Massachusetts, every vote might be counted, there's places like Texas and Florida and Georgia that are going to be so important and come so close that, Republicans are looking to take people's voices away. And obviously fundraising is another big one, right? These candidates tend to avoid big corporate PAC donations. That's one of the reasons we support them, because they're based on grassroots. They're based on running on the issues and the causes we believe in, not on special interest money. And in that sense, they typically tend to be community leaders and activists, right? So a lot of the folks that we're supporting already know how to stretch a dollar, which is why these big, these small grassroots donations really make a big difference in their campaigns. And sometimes they're up against the Democratic Party. In 2020, we saw the whole blacklisting of primary challengers that happened. And, that's still the case. I think before folks joined, when we were on trying out the tech, Larry was talking about how Republicans are supporting some of the Democratic incumbents in these situations because Republicans are so worried that the progressive candidate will be worse for their interests than this, corporately bought Democrat who's already in the seat. So they're supporting a Democratic candidate to try to push against these progressive challengers. So we're up against a lot here in the progressive movement. And what's important is that, people power matters. We've seen that states can flip that, we never thought would. And we've seen that organizing can make such a huge difference. And there's plenty of opportunities out there. So I hope one thing folks can take away is that despite the primary in Massachusetts being in September, we've got primaries that have already started and are in full swing in other states. So there's ways that you can plug in nationwide to help change the narrative on peace issues and to help move the party in a progressive direction.
All right. Thank you so much, Lily. Let's open the floor to a final round of questions or comments. Susan?
Subrata had his hand up. Subrata, would you like to ask?
Thanks. If we have a minute, I just have a specific question about it probably relates most to Larry and Medea, and that is, did the Progressive Caucus take a position regarding the war in Ukraine? And because I've noticed two votes, only one was opposed by Ilhan Omar and Cori Bush. So all those folks from Ro Khanna to AOC and others voted for this increased weapons spending for Ukraine. And the other thing I noted was the vote, and there was 8 Trump Republicans led by Marjorie Taylor. In her statement, she said that we should not be fanning the flames in Ukraine. Was it so difficult for the Progressive Caucus to take a position that we should not be escalating and fanning the flames?
Medea, I'll let you and Larry speak to that, since Subrata wanted to ask you too, and I know that you didn't get questions posed to you, so I'll hand it off to you.
Go ahead, Medea.
Well, in January 26th, I think it was, Barbara Lee and Pramila Jayapal put out a statement saying that there had to be a diplomatic solution to this pending crisis. And it wasn't put out by the whole Progressive Caucus. It was just the two of them. And as far as I know, there have been efforts through the Progressive Caucus to do things like introduce war powers resolutions so that Biden would have to go to Congress to get permission to engage directly in the war. But that has not been a position of the entire Progressive Caucus, as far as I know. Larry, you might have other information.
No, I think you answered it perfectly.
Thank you.
I think, can I just add that the Progressive Caucus, as well as Republicans, I mean, here we have Barbara Lee and Marco Rubio agreeing that a no-fly zone would be a bad thing. So I think the Progressive Caucus is in agreement on that.
Okay.
Steve, you had your hand
Hi.
up?
Yeah, Steve Watrous from Milwaukee. Two things, I guess, if I could. I put them in the chat, but is there money somehow available to tap for grassroots work on getting rid of Senator Ron Johnson, sort of the village idiot of the Senate? And then more particularly with the peace action questionnaire, we've been working through this to work on in the primary on that Senate campaign. And we like some, but we're going to change some others because some are not suitable for sorting between the Democrats and the Dubs. For example, when you say, would you cut $200 billion from the Pentagon? That would be good. More would be better. But no Democrat is going to agree to that. Likewise, the nuclear test ban treaty, to have the U.S. join, probably the Democrats are all in favor of not joining that. So we're looking for good cutting issues. Medea mentioned some of them. If any of you have suggestions on better cutting issues between the more dovish and hawkish Democrats in the primary, that would be a good thing.
I can start with that one. You mentioned the $200 billion from the Pentagon budget. That is a question that we have on our questionnaire. And that is meant to separate out folks who are going to take that stance. And then there's feel free to add more. And sometimes folks will say, at least I support at least this much, if not more. Another question that we have on there is about Israel-Palestine and supporting McCollum's bill. Which shouldn't be controversial as far as I'm concerned, right? It's rights for Palestinian children. Where is the discussion and debate as far as I'm concerned? But obviously it's a bill that some folks are afraid to sign on to. So it's something that we have on the questionnaire to separate out, some folks who might hesitate and not agree on that, as well as a sanctions question, right? And reevaluating our sanctions policy in this country, because that's another place where hawkish interests try to paint sanctions off as an alternative to war, where we all know that they are economic warfare and can be just as devastating. So those are three areas where, to us, they seem like give me questions, but unfortunately, the whole party is not in agreement. And so we often will, root out candidates based on their responses to those three in particular. I have yet to see anyone who has been in favor of, or been against, nuclear weapons reductions or something like that. Like, I think that some of those questions are broadly agreed upon, but they're also not very specific. So that's where we try to make our questionnaire more specific about things like the kind of marquee legislation on cutting certain nuclear weapons systems.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's been a very rich discussion. It's a long way to go. It's a high mountain. At least in our grouping concerned about peace, we're going to continue this discussion a month hence. There are other organizations, Progressive Democrats of America, need to be in this discussion, who are also trying to identify progressive candidates in primaries. And hopefully before too soon, we can get everybody together, maybe behind Larry's Our Revolution list, and try to get some actual coordination rather than just wishing for it. But thank you all so much. And it's hard times, but in hard times, people have to stay clear, stay cool, and keep on keeping on. So thanks, everybody.
Solidarity.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for having us, and keep up the great work out there in Massachusetts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.